Hi, I'm Kathleen O'Connell, National Education Director at the New York Times, and I would like to welcome you to the New York Times in College webcast on resiliency. We'd love to hear from you, so please join the conversation by typing your questions or comments into the space provided. We're pleased to have David Gonzalez with us here today. David is co-editor of the Lens blog and does the biweekly column Side Street in the Metro section. David also served as the About New York columnist and Central America and Caribbean bureau chief. So with that, welcome, David.
Thank you. Good to be here. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. When I was asked to do this talk, it came at an interesting point in my life. I'm 56 years old. I've been at the Times now 23 years. I'm a senior writer. Been getting some honors lately for some of the work that I've accomplished in my career, and it's been a good career, and it continues to be. Yet, it's really funny because for the longest time while I was here, I kind of felt I hadn't really lived up to what my parents had expected of me. I'll give you a little bit of background to explain. I'm the second person in my family to go to college. My parents were working class migrants from Puerto Rico. They worked in factories. My father was a handyman. And so they had great hopes for me when I went off to college. I went off to Yale, and they thought I was going to be a doctor. And I thought I was going to be a doctor because I loved science and I liked all these chemistry courses and bio courses and things like that. But something happens in college when you go to a liberal arts school like Yale. You learn different things. You get exposed to different things. And I found out that, science was good. I was good at science, but maybe it wasn't what I really wanted to do. And as my college journey progressed, I decided by the middle of my first semester, sophomore year, I was going to drop out of being pre-med. I didn't know what I wanted to be, so I took a degree in psychology because I kind of liked psychology. I wasn't thinking about a career. I was just thinking about what I liked. But what really happened was later on, I discovered photography, and I got into photography in a big way, in a huge way. It became like a 24-hour obsession with me. And through photography, I eventually would get into journalism. I'll spare you the details. It's kind of circuitous. My journalism career kind of came about somewhat haphazardly, actually. I didn't set out to be a journalist. Like I said, I was going to be a doctor. But I remember when my father passed away when I had graduated from Yale. I graduated in '79 in May. By March of '80, he was dead. And at his wake, I'll never forget, one of his coworkers said, how's medical school? And I realized my old man never had the nerve to tell his friends at work that I didn't go to medical school, that I had become a photographer, actually. I was working at an arts organization. And that kind of stuck with me, and that kind of stung, if you know what I mean. And eventually I got into journalism in a roundabout way, and like I said, my career did very well. I mean, I was at Newsweek for several years where I worked overseas, I worked nationally, covered presidential campaigns, covered big stories like the invasion of Panama, came to the Times, became a columnist within 5 years of arriving at the New York Times. And yet in the back of my mind there was this little nagging doubt that I'd let my parents down somehow because of this decision, this rash decision that I'd made when I was all of 19 years old and a sophomore at Yale. And I guess that's one of the things that I learned to kind of like go easy on myself about. It hasn't been a bad career. It's been a pretty damn good career, actually. And yet it took a while for me to just relax and get over that moment of youthful indecision about what I wanted to be, which is that when you're 19 years old, you really don't know what you want to be. At least I didn't. And I didn't know I wanted to be a journalist in a real way until I was 26. And so it's kind of interesting that through that period where I was trying to figure it all out, for the longest time, even when I started doing okay in journalism, I kind of held it against me that really I should have been doing something else all along. And that really is, one of the things one of the big lessons I've tried to tell my students when I teach is that, sometimes things change and you got to roll with it a little bit. And things actually might even work out even better than you planned. I think part of me was so focused on what I should have been because my folks thought I should have been a doctor that they really didn't quite understand why I chose what I did. Well, at least my mother. My father passed away, like I said, when I was right out of college. So I mean that's one of the big things. The other thing that I thought about when they talk about resiliency and leadership is, like I said, I've had a really good career and I continue to do the things that I love. I write stories about New York City. I take photographs in New York City that are published about different corners and different people in the city. And then I co-edit the photography blog, which has a global audience of about 850,000 visitors, or page views, I should say. And we write about interesting issues in photography and photojournalism. And it's really good. But again, that kind of also came about in a very weird way. Sometimes you get thrown curveballs. I've been a foreign correspondent. I've traveled to pretty exotic places, pretty grueling places. But about 3 years ago, I got a real curveball thrown at me. I found out that I needed emergency surgery on my spine. One of my discs, my C1, the one at the base of my neck, had disintegrated. And I was facing paralysis, actually, and they had to operate on me right away. You can imagine, after having your spine rebuilt and your neck rebuilt, I got rods and screws here. You can't move the way you used to. And there are certain things I can't do. I mean, little things like I can't ride on a sled with my kids on my stomach because I can't lift my head back all the way because of the rods and screws. Got to be careful when I ride a bike. I can't use my road bike anymore. I got to ride, sitting up like the Wicked Witch of the West, as opposed to hunched over for aerodynamic speed. That's okay. And professionally, there are things I can't do. I can't have any more adventures in places like Haiti or Guatemala or Nicaragua. And that was a bit of it threw me for a loop, because I would always hope maybe one day I'd go back to some of these places and check it out. And I realized I couldn't. And then, about a year and a half after that operation, I got another curveball that I had a pretty serious medical condition. That if I had harbored any fantasy of going back to some of these places, I could pretty much forget about it. My doctors forbade me from going to certain places because of a certain condition that I had developed. And that really was not easy to accept. That was not easy to accept when you realize that you have limitations, very real limitations that you can't negotiate around, you can't bargain with. And so what do you do? In my case, again, it was being open to the possibility of what I can do as opposed to what I couldn't do. One of the things that happens when you get faced with something like this is you focus on the things that are most important to you. You also exclude the stuff that's a distraction, whether that's things that you do or people that you know that kind of take you away from what you need to think about. And in this case, I needed first to think about getting better, emotionally and physically. But then after that was over with, it was like, well, what do I do now? There's so many things I couldn't do. What can I do? And the way I started answering that was, what do I value? And one of the things I realized when I was recuperating on all of this was what I value is photography. I had originally set out to be a photographer. I put it aside and became a writer. And over the last 15 years, I've come to reintegrate photography into my life. So much so that when I was recuperating, I had to take 5 months off. I didn't do a lot of writing, but I photographed every day, especially after I had my neck surgery and that little cervical collar came off and I was able to drive. I went around town a lot and I took pictures every day. Every day I took one picture at least. And I realized that was my way of telling me what really mattered to me, which was photography. And so there came a point when one of my colleagues at the paper said, hey, why don't you think of doing a column where you combine your photography with an essay or a column about what that picture's about or what that part of the city's about. And that kind of spoke to the two things that I cared about, New York City and photography. And then if that wasn't good enough, out of the blue, one of the guys in the photo staff, Jim Estrin, who was one of the founders of the Lens blog, said, hey, do you know anybody who might be interested in being my co-editor at the Lens blog? And if that wasn't enough, I mean, that was like, I was being hit on the head with a hammer about what I want to do in life. I was open to that possibility. And so I basically said to him, are you asking me, do I know anybody, or you're asking me if I want to do it? And he was asking me if I wanted to do it. And that's how I came to do what I do now. I mean, 3 years ago, if you had asked me what I wanted to do, I would have just said, write my column about New York City, do these big stories and what have you. But really, photography wasn't that much a part of it. I mean, I did photography, but it was kind of like on my own time. And 3 years ago, I began this kind of bizarre medical adventure where I got some bad news, some pretty serious news. Got my attention, did what I had to do. But the funny thing is that at the end of this whole process, I am more productive now than I was before. More things are happening for me now than before. And by that I mean, I have, in the past year alone, I had an exhibit of my vintage 1980s photography that just was part of a group show, just took off. It was crazy. I mean, we had hundreds of people at the opening. The pictures were bought. I'm still selling copies of prints from that exhibit. A musician wanted to use one of my photographs on an album cover, which he did. I'm being included in an anthology being put out by the University of Texas Press next spring. An Italian publisher wants to use some of my current photography for a book on street art, because I photograph a lot of street art, graffiti and what have you. And I've never felt more vital. And yet I'm living with a very serious condition. You know, for reasons of my own. I mean, I'm not ashamed of what I have, but I have a 10-year-old son who Googles my name constantly, so I want him to still be a kid. I don't really talk about publicly what I have, but it's a serious, it's the kind of condition that gets your attention, to put it mildly. And yet, despite all that, I am super productive. I am super creative, and you know, it's you know, it's that old cliche, roll with the punches. I've learned how to roll, and I'm glad I learned, because I think when I was younger, I was beating myself up, because you have these expectations of what you should do, that sometimes you realize that maybe what you should do and what you wind up doing might be two different things, and it's okay. I mean, when I was 13, I thought I was going to do one thing with my life. When I was 15, I thought another thing. When I was 20, I thought another thing. It's okay to change. It's as long as you're progressing towards something. And at the age of 56, I don't exempt myself from that. That it's all about continuing that growth and that exploration. I mean, I got inducted into this Journalist Hall of Fame at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists last August, this past month. And you know, it's nice. It's really nice to be acknowledged, but my career is by no means over. In some ways, I'm entering probably the most exciting part of my career right now. And that's really what I wanted to say, was that, you know, when you're 19 or 18, you may not know. And if I could tell the person that I was back then, it's going to be okay, I would say it's going to be okay, because it worked out okay for me. But it also involved getting thrown for a loop, and we're all going to get thrown for a loop sooner or later. And the question is, you know, how do you react to it? How do you bounce back? And how do you give yourself a break, too? I think that's, you know, those are like some of the really important thoughts for me on this one.
Thank you, David. So we have some questions coming in. How can one use resilience to inspire and lead others?
I think, you know, there's a difference between resiliency and being tough. I mean, when I was in high school, I had these track coaches that were tough. They used to shout at you. They used to insult you. They used to like threaten to take away your varsity uniform if you had a bad race. And you know, some of us learned, you know, to be tough and to respond to that. I think adversity sometimes teaches you something, which is that we all make mistakes. It also teaches you to empathize with people, which I think is important if you're going to lead people, is you got to put yourself in their shoes. I think sometimes you got to realize, what are people's strengths? Let's not focus on their weaknesses. Let's look at what are the strengths that they bring to this table and how we can bring that out of them. And I think what I learned in this journey of mine was that sometimes when you have a hard time, it gives you an insight, it gives you an understanding of what other people might be feeling. And you learn to empathize with them, and you learn sometimes maybe to give them a break, or you learn to find out, well, if they're weak in this area, what are they strong in? And can we draw that out of them so they can contribute? I mean, I look at that when I work on the blog. We're a team on the blog. It's not, you know, I mean, we call ourselves co-editors and we have a production person. But when we come into the room to decide what we're going to do, we're all a team. And I think we all know, one way or another, that we bring different strengths to it. We also know that some people have deficiencies, but I think we each, you know, cover for the person or fill in, if you will. We don't hold it against them, I think. I think the real thing is to have that empathy, and I think that's what I think, having gone through some tough times, learning that, you know, we're all going to go through it, and learning to give other people a break sometimes, I think is probably the biggest lesson I learned in some of this stuff.
Great. In your experiences, what events needed to occur before you considered yourself resilient? Did you have any external factors helping you through those experiences?
Yeah, no, external factors indeed. There's a core of people around me. I mean, I know a lot of people, but the people that I consider to be my friends is a much smaller group. I think knowing that it's okay to ask for help, knowing that it's okay to call up friends sometimes and just talk, that was really important for me, especially in my second illness when I was at home a lot, recuperating. I had certain friends who would just drop me an email and say, "You want me to come by?" And I really didn't have much to say, but I'd say, "Sure, come on by." We'd hang out, walk around maybe. That was that was one of the big lessons, is allowing people to come by and help when they wanted to help. And sometimes the help was just their presence. It wasn't necessarily that they were going to come and do something for me. I think one of the things that used to drive me nuts was when people would come by and say, I need to do this for you and this for you. No, you don't need to do anything. Just hanging out and talking, if that even, is enough. I mean, that was really important. I think also realizing that you're not going to go through it alone. I think sometimes we're raised in a certain way that, again, people equate resiliency with this kind of almost absurd individualism, that you got to tough it out and go through it by yourself. And the fact is, there are some things I do by myself, but there are other things where it really was the people with me, helping me. And the biggest help they provided was, accompanying me on this journey, just so I knew that I wasn't alone in all of this. That was, I think, one of the big lessons.
Is there a negative aspect to resiliency, like when it becomes stubbornness or over persistence?
I think, yeah, sometimes you got to know when to give it up. I mean, there are times when you realize something's not going to happen and you got to move on. I think, again, having been raised in the way that I was raised, with working class parents who pinned very high hopes on me being a doctor, I think that was a lot of pressure that I put on myself. And I think it was like sticking with that idea that I was going to go to medical school and do this, when it became clear that really wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. And you kind of can make yourself very unhappy. I mean, I have a lot of friends who became lawyers, and I really don't understand why. It's not a knock on the legal profession. It's just like a lot of them would say, oh, it's a great degree to have because you could do anything you want with it. And I'm like, well, why don't you do what you want to do as opposed to get the degree? Because some of them seemed very unhappy being lawyers. And I think some of them wanted to just basically live up to expectations people had of them. I think, that kind of thing is kind of rough. And the other thing is the expectations that you have of yourself and not being easy on yourself. Again, that you stick to it thinking this is what I have to do because this is how you're tough, this is how you make it, as opposed to seeing what are the things that I'm good at, what are the things that I feel productive at, and moving forward. And again, I think, I'm the father of 2 children, and I think, for them to know in their teens what they want to do for the rest of their life is kind of crazy. I didn't know until I was 26 that I was going to be a journalist. It takes time, and I think that kind of being open to the possibilities of what you can do, especially at this point in your life, is really important. I think when you think that this is what I have to do because this is what I was trained since I was 13, I was going to do this, I think, for some people they know that. But the thing is that you may not be that person, and you are going to change. And so sometimes to stick with something when maybe there's something else you might want to be doing or should be doing, then it becomes counterproductive, I think.
Do you feel that the ability to recover from a hardship quickly reflects a person's leadership capability?
I mean, if you're with other people and you get a setback, you got to think quick. I mean, in the context of a blog, we make decisions every day on the blog. This morning last night we made a decision, something we were going to run in the morning. We found out at 7 o'clock last night we couldn't run. So that meant a piece had to be written overnight and edited and in place by 10 o'clock this morning. And so we just had to roll with it and deal with it right away. And again, today, same thing happened. This morning I discussed with my team what we had to do, and our plans changed. I think, you have to be able to respond very quickly. I think part of it is also being able to respond, to make a decision is important. You can't sometimes just leave it off to the side. I think if you're in a position of leadership, you have to make a decision one way or the other. I think I learned that from some of the editors that I've worked with, that, for better or worse, they made a decision. It was, something had to be done, and a decision was made. Now, whether or not it was the best decision, the most ideal decision, you can debate that later, but I think sometimes if people are looking towards you, you got to do that. The other thing you got to do is stay calm. I learned this the hard way when I got really bad news, medically. But I've also learned it in other situations when I was in certain countries and, violence was breaking out in places like Haiti or in Panama, that you can't panic, especially if you're in a leadership position. If people are looking towards you, you cannot freak out. You have to stay calm. It's very common sense also, though. You're going to think straight. When things are getting nuts, thinking straight, staying calm is the only way to go. You can't really react emotionally too quickly. Again, if people are looking towards you, they're going to get cues from you. And if they see you freaking out, it's going to set the tone for the situation. But also, you make better decisions when you're calmer. And that's happened also sometimes within the workplace, where somebody spots something in the blog, raises a question about something, or a reader raises a question, takes issue with something. And a couple of times we've had situations where one of my colleagues has said, "Oh my God, we got to get the lawyers involved. We got to do this. We got to do that. We got to do this." I'm like, "No. Take 1 second, and we go through it step by step." If somebody raised a question about a particular blog post, okay, let's get to the writer of that post. First, let's talk to the writer. Then we have the writer talk to the person they interviewed. Then they get back to us and tell us what they found out. Then we might get involved in it and start talking to people. Then we might also get involved and talk to the editors above us. And then maybe then, if we need to talk to legal, we'll talk to legal. I mean, that's how you had to proceed. And again, it's a question of other people are involved in this. I'm part of a team. So the question is, they're asking and looking towards me for my advice and my opinion. I wasn't crazy when I got this notification about a particular blog post. I was very upset, in fact. But the way I reacted was basically saying, this is how we do it. The first thing we do is get to the person, start from the beginning and build it up, basically.
Great, thank you. We have a question on roommates. How would you deal with a roommate who is so different from you on so many issues?
I mean, it depends. I mean, freshman year when I was at Yale, my freshman year roommate was very different from me. I mean, I was a Puerto Rican kid from a working class family from the South Bronx, at a time when the South Bronx was a pretty crazy place. And my roommate was from Evanston. He was the son of a doctor. He already knew he wanted to be a psychiatrist at that point. I was into heavy metal. He was into jazz. He had a car. I took the subway everywhere in New York. And yet, he turned me on to jazz. I'd never thought about listening to jazz in my life before, and yet he turned me on. I'll never forget, he turned me on to Rahsaan Roland Kirk, this amazing saxophone player who could play 2 saxophones at once. And, this person that I had nothing in common with at one point became somebody who gave me this gift of loving this music that to this day I still love. I mean, I've gone on to really enjoy jazz and explore it and what have you. So sometimes having somebody who's very, very different from you can be a good thing if you try to find something. We both liked music. We liked very different types of music, but maybe it was there that, I like listening to heavy metal. I like listening to rock. He liked jazz. And so we found listening to each other's music that, we had something in common in a weird way. As opposed to some of the people that I had a lot in common with, actually, after a while it got kind of boring. That some of the folks that I used to run around with all the time in freshman and sophomore year, by the time I got into photography, I was like not really wanting to hang out with them too much because they were into stuff that I really didn't care to do. And by that time, then I just found my own social circles, which consisted mostly of photographers by that point.
Okay. We have another question. Everyone in life is resilient at some point, but not everyone comes out of it a better leader. Do you feel that there is a defining attitude or action that makes someone into a leader during a resilient chapter of their life?
Yeah. I said it before, I think it's empathy. I think it's being able to put yourself in somebody's shoes, realizing in that moment when you're facing a crisis, you're aware of your own vulnerabilities, so you tend to go easy on yourself to some extent. You're aware of your limitations. You become aware of how much you need other people. I mean, in a situation like mine, a medical situation, it's very clear. There's a medical team around me that helps me get through what I have to get through in very real ways. And I think, as a leader, you realize that, there's a team. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but there really is. Nobody succeeds on their own, rarely. You really have to have people around you. And I think that sense of humility, that we're vulnerable, can also be good, though. There's a humility about it that, we're in this together. And I think, the best leaders that I've had in my life have been people who've been able to rally us, sometimes through moments of adversity, sometimes through difficulty, and push us forward. I see that also in some of the stories that I've written over the years about places where I grew up. Like I said, I grew up in the South Bronx. And in the 1970s, there were a lot of fires, a lot of abandonment. The city wasn't paying attention to a lot of these neighborhoods. And what happened over a period of time was some of the people who stayed behind in those neighborhoods banded together. Families who could have left, but those who couldn't leave were stuck. And the way they dealt with it was they got together with other people and figured out what can they do. And they realized that together they were able to raise their voices in a way that got attention and that got results. And I think that sometimes that kind of adversity presents an opportunity for people to band together to find a common goal, if you will, and push forward. And I think that's really what it's about. I think for me, it's always been, a team effort. Leadership is not about me getting the glory, but about us getting somewhere together.
Okay. Do you believe that the United States has proven to be resilient in its endeavors to bounce back from tragedy?
I think we always have. I think, I look at it, you could look at, what happened, a mile and a half from here on September 11th and how we've bounced back from that and how we've dealt with it. I could look at it in terms of neighborhoods in the city that have experienced some really serious problems over the years, and still in some cases still do. I think one of the things that we have is this spirit that we are in together, and I think that is probably us at our best. I know that New Yorkers have this view. Other people look at New Yorkers, for example, as a somewhat individualistic or self-centered breed. I've found the exact opposite. I've found people in neighborhoods in New York to be willing to pitch in, to have that kind of community spirit, to move forward at its best. And I think that is a resiliency that I've witnessed in my own life. And so I think that is something that we value. I've seen it in other places, but I've seen it in other countries where it doesn't work like that, where people are like left to their own devices. But here it's kind of interesting what I've seen in some of the communities in New York City where people have come together, and I think there's that willingness to believe. I think part of it is because I think people come here expecting things are going to be better. And if you work any stretch of time in the third world, in the developing world, you'll see that even in some of the roughest parts here, we do have it better. We do have certain things and certain opportunities that we take for granted perhaps in this country, but in other countries they do not. And I think that gives us the chance to move forward. And I think that's why we still attract so many people from other parts of the world, because they see this country as the kind of place where they can make these things happen.
And we have time for one more question. Who is the most resilient person you know, and why?
The most resilient person I ever met was Father John Flynn. He was a Catholic priest in my old neighborhood of Crotona, which is near the Bronx Zoo. Father Flynn, who passed away last year, inherited a parish where there were homicides pretty much every other week. This is when the crack trade was going crazy. And he was saying funeral masses for teenagers too regularly. And he got really tired. And he got this crazy idea one day, which was he was going to take a crucifix at night and go from corner to corner outside of the stores, in playgrounds, and walk up to the knuckleheads on the corner and say, "Hi, I'm Father Flynn. I'm the priest over at St. Martin at Tours, and I got a deal for you. If you got a gun, I got a crucifix. I'll trade you the gun for the crucifix." And people thought this old white-haired Irish guy was nuts. But you know what? Nobody gave him a gun. Nobody ever did. But what he got was more important. He got their attention, because sooner or later one of those guys was going to get in trouble or needed help. And he realized it was this crazy priest that used to walk the streets talking. He'd go visit him. And he was able to start reaching out to people one-on-one, people who were in real pain, and help them out. He was in a neighborhood that had a lot of problems, and yet I never saw him get upset. I always remember about him was his smile, that he always found something to smile about. Even when things were rough, he found something to celebrate in these communities. And if that ain't resiliency, I don't know what is. Even when he had to retire, he was suffering from dementia, so they made him retire. They put him in a nursing home. Now, this is a guy that used to walk around the streets of his neighborhood talking to people. That's how he ran his parish. He wasn't in the rectory. He was on the streets all the time talking to people. Here he was in a nursing home. So what did he do? He walked the hallways of the nursing home just talking to people. Instead of the streets, he had the hallways. And he did the same exact thing. Just talked to people who, in some cases, just needed somebody to listen to them. That's probably the most resilient person I ever met in my life, Father John Flynn.
Thank you so much, David. That was great. And thanks, everyone, for joining us.